The morning sky over Berlin in the spring of 1948 carried a fragile light, filtered through clouds heavy with smoke and the lingering weight of a city recovering from ruin. Streets that had once pulsed with life were now a lattice of rubble, broken facades, and the tentative sprouts of hope. Amid the gray, children moved cautiously among the remains, their laughter hesitant, punctuated by the echo of distant hammering or the clatter of construction. From above, the air held a different promise, one unnoticed by the hurried footsteps of those below. High over the shattered rooftops, a small transport plane traced an invisible line against the clouds. Inside the cabin, the hum of engines mingled with the quiet murmurs of pilots and crew. Among them, Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen adjusted his headset, eyes narrowing against the sunlight reflecting off broken streets below. He had flown over Berlin before, yet today felt different. Today, he carried not just supplies, but hope, fragile and delicate, like the parachutes he had packed with care in the corners of the aircraft. Each bundle, carefully wrapped, contained candy, gum, chocolate, the simplest of joys, yet capable of piercing despair in ways that food or medicine could not. The children, he knew, were waiting. Perhaps not consciously, not with the full awareness of their desperate circumstances, but instinctively, eyes trained skyward for even the faintest shadow of flight. Gail remembered his own childhood, how small gestures of kindness had lingered in memory long after the moment had passed. He imagined those children, faces smeared with soot and dust, hands clenched around scraps of fabric or fragments of bread, looking up as if the sky itself might offer deliverance. He gripped the controls for a moment, steadying his hands. The aircraft's vibrations hummed through his body, a low, persistent rhythm. The aircrew, seasoned men who had faced winter skies over Europe, cast him curious glances, sensing the difference in his intent. Halvorsen had insisted on making this run personal, deliberate. He wanted the children below to see not just cargo, but a gesture, a promise that someone remembered them. The first drop zone approached, a wide courtyard surrounded by fractured buildings, children gathering, tentative, eyes scanning the sky. Gail opened the compartment, revealing the bundles. He imagined their weightless descent, the parachutes unfurling like tiny wings, carrying chocolate, gum, and the fragile promise of a moment of joy. He adjusted the release mechanism and nodded to the co-pilot. "Ready?" he asked. The co-pilot, seasoned and stoic, gave a curt nod. Gail released the first bundle. Through the open hatch, it floated, pirouetting against the wind, before landing gently amid rubble and rubble-strewn toys. Down below, a group of children looked up, stunned, some pointing, some clapping, some chasing after the tiny parachute with instinctive delight. A boy with wide eyes scooped up the candy, holding it close as if it were the rarest treasure. Halvorsen watched, heart tight. He had flown missions for supplies, for strategy, for the cold calculations of war. Yet here, above a city still trembling from the weight of conflict, he felt something deeper, a connection that transcended policy or protocol. Another bundle followed, and then another, each smaller parachute a tiny message of care dropped from above. In that moment, the air seemed lighter, as if the simple act of generosity could lift the ruins themselves. Below, the children began to call out, voices blending into a chorus that Halvorsen would remember for the rest of his life. "Candy," one shouted. "Chocolates," another cried. Some ran barefoot, some balanced on debris, but all moved with the magnetic pull of curiosity and hope. The pilots in the cabin exchanged glances, a mixture of amusement and awe. This was not a combat mission, not a supply run in the traditional sense. This was something different, an experiment in human kindness, measured not in tons or rations, but in the light that crossed a child's face. Gail leaned back slightly, watching the city unfold beneath him. The streets were still scarred, the buildings broken, but for a few moments, something had changed. A fleeting sense of normality, a spark of delight, a reminder that even in ruin, life persisted. Later, when the mission ended and the aircraft banked back toward the airfield, Gail could still see children chasing after the remnants of his drops, laughter echoing faintly across the empty courtyards. The other pilots respected the silence that fell over him, knowing it was not fatigue but reflection. The Berlin Airlift had brought food, medicine, coal, and supplies, yet it was these small parachutes of candy that carried a more enduring legacy. They reminded people, even in the aftermath of war, that humanity could be preserved in gesture, in attention, in care. As the plane descended toward the field, Halvorsen allowed himself a quiet smile. He did not know the names of the children, would not meet most of them, and yet he had shared a moment that transcended circumstance, a fleeting bridge across despair. That moment, fragile as the paper wrapping of a chocolate bar, was a lifeline, a whisper of hope amid the rubble. Even years later, when memory had dulled some details but sharpened others, he would remember the sunlight on the broken buildings, the wide-eyed children, and the quiet certainty that small acts could ripple across a city like wind across water. The Berlin sky, heavy with history, had been witness to something ordinary made extraordinary by intention. And in that simple act, dropping candy from an airplane, giving children a momentary taste of sweetness in a bitter world, Gail Halvorsen had begun a legacy that would echo far beyond the ruined streets, beyond the hardened adults, beyond the war itself. The day stretched slowly over Berlin, each hour marked by the rhythm of recovery and the hum of air traffic overhead. The city was alive in its own fragile way, street vendors carefully arranging what little produce they could salvage, children weaving between the rubble, and the faint scent of coal smoke lingering over shattered rooftops. High above, Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen adjusted his headset, scanning the streets below for familiar drop zones. Each mission had a pattern, yet none were identical. Every courtyard, every open plaza, every gap between crumbled buildings offered a new opportunity to surprise the children waiting with anticipation he could almost feel. The co-pilot tapped the controls, and the aircraft hummed in response, a steady companion to Gail's thoughts. "They're waiting," he said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "We just have to reach them." The bundles of candy were neatly stacked in the cabin, each wrapped carefully, parachutes tucked and ready for release. They were simple, chocolate bars, gum, caramels, but in this city, they were treasures, tangible symbols of normalcy, of sweetness in a bitter world. Gail remembered watching the children scramble for the first drops, their small bodies moving instinctively toward the falling packages, their eyes alight with disbelief and joy. He smiled again, thinking of the boy who had clutched the first chocolate bar to his chest, as if holding hope itself. The plane banked slightly as it approached the next drop zone. Halvorsen peered through the open hatch, calculating the wind, the trajectory, the timing. Each release was a delicate experiment in physics and compassion, the bundle needing to land safely among the children without being crushed by debris or lost to puddles of water. He imagined the children watching the sky, their heads tilted upward, mouths open in anticipation. Perhaps some recognized the familiar shadow of the plane, the rhythmic drone of its engines, and whispered to each other about what might come next. He wondered what their thoughts were, whether they understood that this small sweetness was part of a larger effort, part of a story that stretched beyond their immediate survival. "Ready?" he asked, voice calm but filled with purpose. The co-pilot nodded. Gail released the first bundle, watching as it twirled gracefully on its tiny parachute, descending slowly toward the courtyard. Below, the children spotted it instantly. A small chorus of shouts erupted, laughter, exclamations, and the clattering of bare feet against broken pavement. Some sprinted to catch it before it landed, others simply raised their hands, eyes wide, reveling in the unexpected gift from above. The parachute landed softly among rubble and scattered toys. A girl with pigtails scooped up the candy, holding it tightly as if it were a gem. Gail felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. He had flown countless missions during the war, had delivered cargo, carried strategic supplies, and faced danger, yet none of that compared to this. Here, he was delivering something far more fragile and infinitely more human. Another bundle followed, and then another. With each descent, he saw the children's wonder grow, their disbelief slowly transforming into joy, even if only for a fleeting moment. The co-pilot glanced at him, curiosity and quiet admiration in his eyes. You really care about them, don't you? He asked. Gail didn't answer immediately. He shook his head slightly, letting his thoughts drift over the rooftops below. It's not just care, he said finally. It's remembering what it feels like to be a child, to want something simple and pure, even when the world is broken. The aircraft hummed steadily above Berlin, its engines a lullaby for hope, a rhythm that matched the pulse of a city learning to breathe again. On the ground, a small crowd gathered as word spread, the candy plane had returned. Children ran to the open spaces, pointing upward, shouting to each other, urging the sky to deliver another small miracle. For a few minutes, the city below was transformed. Broken walls became stages, crumbled pavement became racetracks for racing feet, and every chocolate bar that landed became a tiny spark in the long, gray landscape. Halvorsen leaned against the hatch frame, watching the unfolding scene with quiet satisfaction. The city still bore scars, the war was not over in memory, only in truce. Yet he had seen joy rise from despair, however fleeting. He understood, in that instant, that these small parachutes carried more than candy, they carried hope, a reminder of humanity, and a connection between the world above and the lives below. When the last bundle was released and the aircraft turned to leave, Gail took one final look at the courtyard. Children clutched their parcels, faces bright with wonder, some calling up to the sky with gratitude that words could barely contain. He imagined them running home to share their treasures, the wrappers torn carefully to reveal chocolate, gum, sweetness that was both literal and symbolic. Silence returned inside the cabin, but it was not emptiness, it was reflection. The crew, seasoned by conflict and routine, understood the weight of what they had witnessed, the unspoken acknowledgement of the significance of their flight. Gail sat back, eyes drifting to the horizon where the clouds met the city's rooftops, considering the fragile power of small gestures. This was not a mission of strategic advantage or political leverage. This was a mission of humanity, a recognition that amid devastation, small kindnesses could ripple through a city, touching hearts and preserving innocence. The plane's hum continued as Berlin receded behind them, but the image of children chasing tiny parachutes, faces alight with joy amid ruin, remained vivid in Gail's mind. Years later, when he recalled the Berlin Airlift, it would not be the numbers, the logistics, or even the planes that stayed with him, it would be those moments of connection, the laughter and astonishment of children who had learned, however briefly, that someone cared, that the sky itself could deliver sweetness. And as the aircraft soared toward the clouds, Halvorsen allowed himself a quiet, hopeful thought, that in the midst of brokenness, even the smallest acts could become legacies, lasting far beyond the span of one flight, one city, or one war. In the courtyards of Berlin, the children waited with a mixture of hope, skepticism, and the instinctive resilience that had grown from months of hardship. Some had known nothing but rubble and ration lines for as long as they could remember, their games played among cracked walls and shattered bricks, their laughter cautious and brief. Yet when the first tiny parachutes descended, their reactions were instantaneous and pure. Eyes widened, mouths opened in disbelief, and for a moment, the weight of hunger, fear, and uncertainty lifted as if carried away by the wind. A group of boys scrambled over broken paving stones, hoisting themselves to catch a chocolate bar midair. One fell, scraped his knee on the jagged surface, but laughter followed the cry of pain, a strange mixture of joy and surprise. A girl with a ragged doll clutched in one hand darted forward, arms outstretched, and retrieved a bundle of gum, examining it as though it were the rarest jewel. She tore the wrapper carefully, inhaling the scent before offering a small piece to a friend. The smallest gestures, these shared sweets, became acts of connection and normality in a world that had lost so much. News of the candy drop spread quickly. Word passed from courtyard to courtyard, whispered from child to child, a story carried through alleys and over fences. The candy plane became a legend in the making, an invisible hand of kindness moving above the city, defying the rubble, the ration lines, and the lingering fear. The children did not know the pilot's name, they did not need to. He was a presence in the sky, a force of joy, and an emblem of something larger, hope. In quiet moments, they would glance upward, scanning the gray clouds for that familiar shape, their small bodies poised in anticipation, fingers clutching ragged toys or scraps of bread. When a bundle appeared, it was more than chocolate or gum, it was proof that the world had not forgotten them, that despite the ruins, there were adults who still cared, who still remembered how it felt to be small and hungry, to crave sweetness and light. Parents observed from a distance, wary of the attention but quietly moved by the children's reactions. They whispered among themselves, marveling at the simple ingenuity, the generosity above, and the ways it seemed to restore something intangible. Even in those shattered streets, amid the uncertainty and the shadows of war, they allowed themselves a flicker of gratitude. The children adapted quickly to this new ritual. They learned to anticipate the approach of aircraft, to read the wind and the angle of descent, and even to signal the parachutes with hands or makeshift flags. It became a game, yes, but one with deep emotional resonance. It was survival intertwined with wonder, the instinct to participate in life itself despite the remnants of destruction surrounding them. Teachers and caretakers noted changes in behavior as well. Children who had been withdrawn or fearful began to engage more readily with each other, sharing not only candy but stories, small secrets, and dreams of the future. The parachutes, small as they were, seemed to carry more than sweetness, they carried vitality, optimism, and a renewed sense of community. Halvorsen and his fellow pilots remained unaware of much of the subtleties unfolding below. Yet from the air, they could see the patterns, children chasing in organized chaos, laughing, shouting, and lifting each other to heights of exhilaration, temporarily free from hunger and fear. Over time, he began to notice changes on subsequent flights, courtyards cleared of debris for easier landings, small signs or drawings attached to makeshift poles to guide the drops, and even tiny flags waving in greeting. The city itself seemed to participate in the ritual, a quiet acknowledgement that joy could emerge even in the harshest circumstances. Parents, neighbors, and even older children contributed, improvising games, sharing the candy more equitably, and protecting the youngest from the crush of excitement. These small acts reflected the resilience of a community unwilling to let despair define it. Halvorsen could not see the full depth of these developments, but he would feel the impact in later correspondence, in letters from families and educators, expressing gratitude and sharing stories of the children's delight and renewed energy. Each package released had a ripple effect, touching lives beyond the immediate courtyard, sustaining a fragile optimism that would persist for weeks and months. Yet even amid the laughter, shadows lingered. Children who had lost siblings, who had faced hunger so severe that sweetness seemed a memory, or who had seen homes vanish under bombed-out ruins, carried scars not visible in the moment. The parachutes did not erase suffering, but they offered acknowledgement, a reminder that they were seen, that someone cared. And that acknowledgement, though small and fleeting, was profound. Over time, the legend of the candy bomber spread beyond the immediate neighborhoods. Word reached newspapers, radio stations, and eventually other parts of the city. Adults, initially skeptical, began to recognize the psychological and emotional significance of the drops. They understood that while bread, coal, and medicine sustained the body, these small parcels of chocolate and gum nourished something equally essential, the human spirit. For the children, each bundle was a message from the sky, that joy could exist in despair, that the world above still remembered them, and that kindness, even small and indirect, could traverse walls, rubble, and fear. The ritual of watching, waiting, and chasing the tiny parachutes became ingrained, a symbol of resilience and hope, and a shared experience that knit communities together even amid destruction. In those moments, Berlin's children reclaimed fragments of childhood stolen by war. Learning to delight in simple pleasures, to trust the unknown, and to connect with one another through shared anticipation and laughter. And for Gail Halvorsen, each flight became more than a mission, it became a dialogue, silent but profound, between sky and street, pilot and child, past and present, despair and hope. The legend of the candy bomber was taking shape not through newspapers or official recognition, but through the sparkling eyes of children who dared to look up and believe, if only for a few moments, that sweetness could descend from the heavens. As the Berlin Airlift continued, the air above the city grew thick with the hum of transport planes, each carrying essentials, coal, flour, medicine, and occasionally, the small parcels that would come to be known as candy drops. For Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen, the work was methodical but never mundane. Every flight was a delicate choreography, balancing altitude, speed, wind currents, and the unpredictable gusts that swept through the city. The candy, meticulously packed in small bundles, was more than a treat, it was a carefully calculated message of hope. Halvorsen's innovation was simple yet profound. By attaching miniature parachutes, he could ensure the candy descended gently among the children without risk of injury. Each bundle became a symbol of attention, thoughtfulness, and human care in a city still shivering from months of deprivation. The co-pilot and crew watched Halvorsen with a mixture of admiration and mild bemusement. Many had flown over Berlin countless times, delivering necessities, yet none had considered adding whimsy or joy to their mission. To them, the airlift was work, critical and precise. To Halvorsen, it was also a human conversation, a dialogue between pilot and child, air and street, despair and delight. Below, the children adapted quickly. They learned to anticipate the plane's approach, to read the subtle signals in engine hums and shadows. Some brought small flags to wave, hoping to guide the parachutes, others improvised catch methods, using scraps of cloth or even bundled jackets. The courtyards and open spaces became stages for a ritual of ingenuity, cooperation, and sheer delight. Parents and neighbors encouraged it quietly, understanding that these small joys carried immense psychological weight. In the office at Tempelhof Air Base, Halvorsen began coordinating with fellow pilots who shared his vision. Word had spread among the crews, a few candy drops could spark laughter and wonder in a city still haunted by war. Others joined in, carefully packing bundles, sometimes with handwritten notes of encouragement. The operation remained unofficial, a gentle rebellion against the stark calculations of logistics and supply. The planes flew, and with each successful drop, the reputation of the candy bomber grew. Reports filtered back from the courtyards, children clustering around parachutes, sharing the candy, and savoring each morsel. Some children, who had rarely experienced unstructured play, found themselves improvising games around the drops, racing to the landing sites, balancing on rubble, and laughing together. Halvorsen noticed patterns emerging. Certain courtyards consistently drew crowds, certain times of day offered better wind conditions. He began to refine his routes, not for efficiency alone, but for maximum engagement and joy. Even minor miscalculations were instructive. A parachute landing atop debris could teach both pilot and child new strategies for handling the next delivery. Beyond the streets, the story began to seep into public consciousness. Journalists and reporters took note of the phenomenon, sharing tales of candy descending from the sky. Berliners, weary and cautious, passed the news along in whispers and conversation, marveling at the ingenuity of an American pilot who thought to bring sweetness into the rubble. Children became local celebrities of sorts, recognized for their courage in chasing down the parachutes, and occasionally appearing in photographs that documented these small but profound acts of normalcy. Halvorsen himself remained modest, never seeking recognition. Each flight was a personal commitment, a reminder that one person could impact countless lives through careful thought and genuine care. He reflected often on his own childhood, on small acts of kindness he had once received, and on the lasting impression they had left. In doing so, he sought to replicate that effect, creating a bridge between past and present, between an individual and a city that needed more than material sustenance. The airlift itself continued to be a monumental operation, a vast orchestration of military precision and international coordination. Yet within this massive endeavor, Halvorsen carved a niche of humanity. While the planes below carried coal to heat homes and flour to feed families, the candy drops carried the intangible, hope, delight, and the assertion that joy could exist even amid scarcity. Each flight also brought new lessons. Wind patterns shifted, children's techniques for catching the parcels evolved, the city itself seemed to respond, opening spaces and clearing debris to accommodate the ritual. Halvorsen documented these changes in small notes, not as formal reports but as personal reflections, reminders of how small, intentional acts could magnify in unexpected ways. Even as the airlift entered its busiest months, the candy drops became more organized. Some bundles included small letters, carefully written notes encouraging children to take care of themselves and each other. It was a quiet human experiment, unfolding in real time, witnessed in the eyes of the children and the laughter that ricocheted off broken walls. And yet, there was always awareness of the fragility of the operation. A dropped bundle could be lost to wind, crushed under rubble, or misdirected. The risk of disappointment was constant, and each failure was felt acutely. Halvorsen understood that hope was delicate, requiring care, precision, and empathy. On the ground, children noticed this too. Some would cheer the bundles that landed safely, others would console friends whose parcels were lost or damaged. In these small gestures, the seeds of community, compassion, and resilience took root. Parents and teachers recognized the broader impact. These small interventions nurtured not only sweetness but moral growth, shared experience, and collective joy. By the end of the day, as Halvorsen returned to base, he often lingered in thought, reflecting on the cumulative effect of dozens of drops. He knew the chocolate and gum would be consumed quickly, but the memory, the laughter, the anticipation, the sense of being noticed, would linger far longer. Each mission was more than a flight, it was an exercise in empathy, precision, and the enduring power of small kindnesses. Berlin, slowly rebuilding, was being reminded daily that even in the shadow of devastation, humanity persisted, one parachute at a time. Word of the candy bomber spread quickly beyond the courtyards and alleyways where children first chased the tiny parachutes. At first, it was whispers, neighbors sharing stories over fences, mothers recounting how their children had raced to catch a chocolate bar, fathers marveling at the ingenuity of a pilot who could find joy amid the gray skies. Soon, reporters and photographers arrived, documenting the phenomenon with cameras and notebooks, eager to capture the fleeting moments of delight amid destruction. Halvorsen remained humble, never seeking the spotlight. To him, the mission was never about fame. It was about connection, a silent conversation between sky and street, pilot and child, human and human. Each drop carried lessons, not only in physics but in empathy. The children below learned to anticipate, improvise, and share, while Halvorsen learned the subtle, powerful effects of attention, care, and thoughtfulness. As planes hummed over Berlin day after day, the legend grew. Some adults speculated about the pilot, constructing stories to explain the seemingly magical appearances of candy from the clouds. Was it one man? A coordinated effort? A mysterious benefactor? The truth was simple yet profound. A single lieutenant, moved by the sight of children clinging to life amid rubble, had chosen to intervene with what he could offer. Beyond the immediate joy of chocolate and gum, these drops carried a psychological significance that scholars, reporters, and later historians would note for decades. Children who had experienced months of scarcity found not just sweetness, but a restoration of wonder and trust in the world. Courtyards became places of anticipation. Children would gather, their eyes scanning the skies, hands outstretched in hope. They communicated in gestures and signals, improvising methods to catch the parachute safely and fairly. Older children acted as guides, directing younger ones, ensuring that no one was left behind or overlooked. The process was small, yet it cultivated community, resilience, and cooperation in a city struggling to reclaim normalcy. Halvorsen, flying above, often witnessed these subtle dynamics through the open hatch. He saw children cheer when a bundle landed successfully, console friends when it did not, and share the sweets with one another once collected. In these moments, he realized the depth of the impact he had created, far beyond what a single candy drop could convey. Every flight offered variations and surprises. Weather shifted unexpectedly, gusts of wind threatened to carry a parachute astray, yet the children adapted, becoming expert participants in the ritual. They adjusted their positions, learned to estimate descent speed, and even created small signaling devices, waving scraps of cloth or tiny flags to guide the drops. What began as a simple act of generosity had evolved into a participatory event, a daily exercise in hope, skill, and shared joy. Adults observed quietly, often smiling at the ingenuity of their children. They understood that these moments of delight, however brief, carried weight far beyond mere amusement. For some, it was the first taste of normalcy they had experienced in months. For others, it was reassurance that someone outside their fractured world remembered them, cared for them, and had taken the effort to reach across borders and rubble to bring them comfort. Recognition of Halvorsen's work spread to military circles as well. Fellow pilots began to emulate his approach, quietly packing small parcels for their own drops, extending the gesture of kindness without the fanfare of publicity. Commanders, aware but never fully intervening, allowed the practice to continue, acknowledging its positive effects on morale both above and below the airlift. The air became a conduit for connection. Berlin's skies, once a symbol of devastation and control, transformed into avenues of hope. Parachutes twirled delicately against clouds, each bundle a testament to thoughtfulness, intention, and the subtle artistry of human care. The children's response was equally profound. Anticipation, skill, joy, cooperation, and shared laughter became daily rituals, embedding themselves into the rhythms of the city's slow recovery. Over weeks, the legend of the Candy Bomber became almost mythic. Children spoke of him as a hero who descended from the heavens, while adults recognized the extraordinary power of ordinary human kindness. Photographs circulated, capturing wide-eyed children clutching candy bundles amidst rubble-strewn courtyards. The juxtaposition was stark and moving, innocence and joy rising above destruction, fragile but persistent. Halvorsen, despite the growing attention, continued with quiet determination. Each flight was meticulously planned, each drop executed with care, every bundle packed with the awareness that even the smallest error could alter the intended effect. Yet he embraced the unpredictability of wind and descent, finding in it the lessons of humility and patience. In the evenings, he reflected on the transformations he had witnessed below. Children had regained a measure of agency, parents a sense of reassurance, and communities a fragile cohesion born from shared experience. What had begun as a simple gesture had grown into a sustained human intervention, a daily assertion that joy, however modest, could persist even amid adversity. Years later, historians and chroniclers would look back on these flights and note their significance, not in tons of candy delivered but in the intangible restoration of spirit they represented. Halvorsen's actions illustrated that even in vast, complex operations like the Berlin Airlift, individual initiative, empathy, and ingenuity could have profound, lasting effects. And as the aircraft lifted above the city for yet another mission, the rhythmic hum of engines became more than a mechanical sound, it became a heartbeat connecting sky and street. Pilot and child, despair and hope. The Candy Bomber had taken flight not only in the air but in memory, imagination, and the enduring spirit of Berlin's children, leaving a legacy that would echo long after the parachutes had dissolved into history. As the months of the Berlin Airlift progressed, Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen found moments of quiet reflection between flights. The roar of engines and the steady hum of propellers often filled the aircraft, but in the solitude of these moments, he allowed himself to think deeply about the lives he had touched and the children who had changed him in ways he could scarcely articulate. Sitting in the cockpit, staring at the horizon where the gray clouds met the patchwork of rooftops and rubble, he considered the improbable chain of events that had transformed a simple gesture into a legend. Each candy drop had begun as an instinctive act of compassion, a response to the faces of children peering skyward with yearning and hope. Yet, in the unfolding weeks, those small parcels had become symbols of resilience, humanity, and the delicate bridge between despair and delight. Halvorsen thought often about the children's eyes, the wide, luminous pools of anticipation, their expressions frozen in moments of surprise, delight, and awe as parachutes descended gently into their hands. He remembered the ingenuity they displayed, how they learned to catch the bundles safely, to share with friends, and even to signal their intentions to the skies above. It was a dialogue of empathy, unspoken but profoundly understood. The city, too, seemed to respond. Courtyards cleared of debris, neighbors collaborating to ensure equitable sharing, and the subtle rhythms of anticipation became woven into daily life. Halvorsen realized that the candy was never the true gift. The gift was the restoration of trust, hope, and the fragile sense of childhood that war had threatened to erase. Letters from families and educators began to arrive, small but potent reminders of the ripples he had created. Stories of children who had been too shy or frightened to leave their homes, yet braved the streets to chase a parachute, touched him deeply. Some letters spoke of newfound laughter echoing through formerly silent courtyards, of friendships forged over shared sweets, of optimism rekindled amid scarcity. Each account reinforced the significance of seemingly modest actions, demonstrating that care and attention could resonate far beyond immediate material value. Halvorsen reflected also on the broader context, the political tensions, logistical challenges, and immense human cost of the Berlin Airlift. Yet within this massive operation, he had found a space for intimacy, for personal connection, and for creativity in service of humanity. The aircraft above Berlin was no longer merely a transporter of coal or flour, it had become a vessel for hope, a conduit between one man's empathy and the countless lives below. In the quiet hours, he allowed himself to contemplate the long-term effects. How many children would remember these parachutes in their adult years? How many would carry the knowledge that someone, unseen but attentive, had reached across rubble and sky to bring a fragment of joy into their lives? He understood that the tangible candy would be consumed quickly, but the emotional imprint, the memory of being noticed, of being valued, would linger far longer. Fellow pilots began to emulate his approach, inspired not only by the practical success of the drops but by the profound human response they elicited. The practice spread quietly, organically, touching additional courtyards and neighborhoods. In this way, the legacy expanded beyond Halvorsen himself, reinforcing the notion that individual initiative, empathy, and thoughtful creativity could propagate widely, even amid the machinery and logistics of large-scale operations. The public recognition of his efforts eventually reached higher levels. Stories circulated in newspapers and broadcasts, capturing the imagination of a broader audience. Yet Halvorsen remained humble, insisting that the mission's value lay not in publicity but in genuine human connection. For him, the greatest reward had always been the laughter, the wide eyes, and the small hands clutching the parachutes with reverence. He remembered the boy who had first grasped a chocolate bar as if it were the rarest treasure, the girl who shared gum with a friend despite her own hunger, and the countless other moments that illustrated resilience, empathy, and the continuity of childhood amid adversity. In reflecting on these memories decades later, Halvorsen recognized that the airlift had been as much an emotional operation as a logistical one. It demonstrated the power of small acts to effect change, the ways in which attention, intention, and kindness could alter the rhythms of daily life for communities recovering from trauma. The candy parachutes had been tiny interventions, yet their cumulative effect had been extraordinary. Moreover, he understood that the legend of the candy bomber was not his alone. It belonged to every child who had run to catch a bundle, every parent who encouraged sharing, every neighbor who ensured fairness, and every fellow pilot who had followed suit. It was a testament to the human capacity for cooperation, empathy, and creativity, even in the harshest circumstances. The lessons endured. Halvorsen carried them forward in the years that followed, into lectures, interviews, and personal conversations. He spoke not of heroism or accolades, but of attention, empathy, and the enduring impact of small, deliberate gestures. He reminded audiences that acts of care, however modest, could ripple outward, shaping communities, restoring trust, and creating legacy. And Berlin itself, once fractured and scarred by conflict, retained a memory of those parachutes, of the flights, and of the profound message they carried, that humanity could prevail amid adversity, and that hope, like the wind, could travel from one heart to another, lifting spirits high above rubble and despair. As Halvorsen gazed once more toward the horizon, he allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. Not in fame or recognition, but in the knowledge that his flights had mattered, that joy had flown with him, and that even in moments of darkness, light could descend from above, carried gently by parachutes and by the enduring human spirit. After the airlift concluded, Gail Halvorsen returned to the United States, carrying with him the quiet satisfaction of work well done and the memories of countless flights over Berlin. Yet he quickly realized that the impact of his missions had extended far beyond the city itself. Letters continued to arrive, some decades old, sent by children who had grown into adults and remembered the parachutes and chocolate with vivid clarity. In those letters, they recounted the transformative power of the small bundles, the lessons of hope and kindness, and the enduring imprint of being seen and cared for during their most vulnerable years. Halvorsen often read these letters alone, the dim light of his study casting soft shadows on the pages. Each word reminded him that what might have seemed a trivial act, a simple candy drop, was, for these children, monumental. Across the Atlantic, Berlin itself was rebuilding, slowly and painstakingly. Streets were repaved, buildings reconstructed, and a sense of normalcy began to emerge. Yet in the hearts of Berlin's citizens, the memory of the candy drops remained vivid, a symbol of resilience and the unexpected kindness that had pierced through hardship. The story of the candy bomber gradually reached the public consciousness. Newspapers and radio segments highlighted the ingenuity and compassion behind Halvorsen's actions. Scholars and historians recognized the psychological and social value of his missions, noting how small, deliberate gestures could fortify communities recovering from trauma. Halvorsen, however, remained modest. He shunned overt publicity, preferring to emphasize the collective effort, the children who participated actively, the families who facilitated fairness and sharing, and the fellow pilots who quietly followed his example. For him, the narrative was never about individual heroism but about humanity's capacity to act with empathy, even in constrained or chaotic circumstances. Over the years, Halvorsen's legacy was formally recognized. Awards, medals, and invitations to speak at schools, universities, and public forums allowed him to share the story of the Berlin Airlift from a deeply personal perspective. Yet he continued to stress the human dimension rather than the accolades, the laughter of a child, the communal joy of catching a parachute, and the subtle but enduring ways in which hope can flourish even amid devastation. The cultural impact of his flights extended beyond Berlin. In classrooms across the United States and Europe, teachers recounted the story of the candy bomber as an example of moral courage, creativity, and the ripple effect of small acts. Scholars studied the missions not merely as historical events but as demonstrations of empathy in practice, exploring how attention, care, and imaginative problem-solving could reshape social environments and psychological outcomes. In interviews, Halvorsen often reflected on the enduring lessons that even within structured, hierarchical systems like military operations, there exists space for individual initiative that can touch lives, that gestures of kindness need not be grandiose to be transformative, and that hope, when delivered thoughtfully, can have profound and lasting effects. The children of Berlin, now adults themselves, carried these lessons forward. Some became educators, social workers, or community organizers, citing the candy drops as early experiences that shaped their understanding of generosity, trust, and communal responsibility. In this way, the parachutes had traveled farther than the streets they fell upon, they had imprinted values and inspiration into generations. For Halvorsen personally, the story was a continuous dialogue between memory and action. Each flight, each parachute, each child's gleeful reaction had reinforced a lifelong philosophy, that human connection, creativity, and attention to detail could create extraordinary outcomes from ordinary means. Even as decades passed and the world changed around him, he held fast to that understanding. He recognized that history often remembers grand battles, strategic maneuvers, and political shifts, yet the most enduring legacies sometimes reside in the quiet acts of empathy that ripple through ordinary lives. The parachutes, tiny and fragile, had become symbols of hope, resilience, and the human capacity to act with intentional compassion. And as historians, educators, and storytellers recounted the Berlin Airlift and Halvorsen's unique contribution, the narrative remained grounded in the human experience, children laughing amid rubble, communities weaving connections through shared delight, and a single pilot whose creativity and empathy bridged the distance between sky and street, despair and joy. In the final analysis, the Candy Bomber was not merely a man or a title, it was an idea, a principle, a living demonstration that even in the aftermath of conflict, in the shadows of destruction, the smallest acts of thoughtfulness could ripple outward, changing lives in ways both profound and enduring. Halvorsen's story would continue to inspire, reminding generations that hope can descend gently, borne on wings, and land softly in the hands of those who need it most. Some flights over Berlin became etched in Halvorsen's memory with extraordinary clarity. One particular mission stood out, not for the number of bundles dropped, but for the palpable intensity of hope and anticipation that radiated from the children below. The city's ruins stretched beneath the plane, gray and fragmented, yet alive with movement as small figures gathered in open courtyards. Halvorsen adjusted his headset and glanced at the co-pilot, who returned a knowing nod. Today, they carried extra bundles, carefully wrapped and prepared, each with a parachute tailored for gentle descent. The wind currents were tricky that morning, swirling unpredictably between the skeletal buildings and fractured streets. Yet Halvorsen's calculations were precise. Years of flight experience and instinct guided his hands. As the first bundle was released, it floated gracefully downward, twisting slightly, caught in an updraft before settling safely amid a group of children. The reaction below was immediate. A chorus of laughter, shouts, and the clatter of feet over debris erupted in unison. A small boy ran, tripped over a displaced brick, and rose again, clutching the chocolate bar as if it were the rarest treasure. The scene encapsulated the fragile beauty of the airlift, despair, hope, and resilience intertwined in a single, fleeting moment. Halvorsen watched, heart tightening with emotion. The flight was more than a mechanical operation, it was a communion between sky and street, pilot and child, intention and joy. Each successful drop reinforced the invisible threads connecting him to the lives below, reminding him of the profound impact small gestures could wield. Over time, Halvorsen developed a subtle system of signaling. By wiggling the wings or adjusting engine hums, he communicated with observant children, creating a rhythm they came to recognize. The children learned to anticipate these signals, raising hands, waving flags, or positioning themselves strategically to catch the descending bundles. The dialogue was silent, almost imperceptible, yet infinitely meaningful, a choreography of trust and attention that transcended words. On one occasion, a young girl held a hand-lettered sign that read, "Thank you, sir," attached to a scrap of cardboard. Halvorsen caught sight of it from the cockpit and felt a lump form in his throat. The significance was overwhelming. In a city scarred by war, in lives punctuated by hardship and scarcity, a child had reached out with gratitude, acknowledging an unseen benefactor who had bridged distance, rubble, and trauma with chocolate and gum. Fellow pilots began to notice his approach. Some joined in, improvising their own drops, and the practice quietly spread across the fleet. Halvorsen had inadvertently created a network of empathy, an operation nested within the larger logistics of the airlift. The cumulative effect was profound. Courtyards that had once echoed only with silence now thrummed with energy. Children collaborated to catch the bundles safely, shared their treasures, and in doing so, learned cooperation, trust, and generosity. Even adults observed subtle changes, laughter returned to streets, communal bonds strengthened, and the children's anticipation created a cadence of hope that permeated the urban landscape. Halvorsen's own reflections deepened with each flight. He pondered the fragile power of small interventions and their capacity to ripple through human experience. The chocolate and gum were ephemeral, consumed quickly, yet the emotional impact endured, shaping memory, behavior, and social cohesion. In his letters and later speeches, he emphasized that the airlift's success was not merely in tons of coal or flour delivered, but in these micro-moments of connection, proof that human creativity and care could alter psychological and communal landscapes profoundly. Some of his most poignant memories came from encounters after flights. Children would wave from courtyards, clutching empty wrappers, faces beaming, eyes alight with recognition. On rare occasions, letters were sent via parents, conveying thanks and sharing stories of how the drops had influenced behavior, mood, and community dynamics. These communications reinforced the idea that empathy, like any resource, could be nurtured, replicated, and expanded across time and space. Halvorsen also reflected on the personal lessons. Patience, observation, calculation, and creativity, skills honed in wartime operations, were repurposed for compassion. The airlift became an exercise in both technical skill and moral insight, demonstrating the intersection of human capability with ethical imagination. Even decades later, Halvorsen recalled the faces of the children vividly, expressions of awe, laughter resonating off broken walls, hands raised to meet the sky. Each memory was a testament to resilience, a proof that even amid devastation, joy could flourish when met with intentional kindness. And yet, he acknowledged the fragility of these moments. A miscalculated drop could disappoint, a gust of wind could carry a parachute astray, and the ephemeral nature of candy reminded him that hope, too, required careful tending. The act of giving, when done thoughtfully, required attention, empathy, and humility. The candy bomber legend was not about spectacle, it was about subtle, deliberate intervention. Each mission reinforced this principle, transforming Halvorsen's flights from mere logistics into an enduring moral experiment. The stories of children, parents, and fellow pilots merged into a tapestry of collective memory. Photographs, letters, and oral histories captured the vibrancy, ingenuity, and emotional depth of these small acts. The airlift, monumental in scale and necessity, was interwoven with these intimate moments, illustrating that history's grand narratives often contain deeply personal threads. In quiet reflection, Halvorsen understood that his role had been both extraordinary and ordinary. Extraordinary in the reach of his actions and the joy they inspired, ordinary in their simplicity, a pilot, candy, parachutes, children waiting in courtyards. The combination, however, created a resonance that transcended time, geography, and circumstance. And as he looked back over decades, he recognized that these flights, these parachutes, and the children's wide-eyed delight represented not just a chapter of history, but a paradigm of human possibility, that even in the aftermath of devastation, small, intentional gestures could shape memory, nurture hope, and foster enduring connection between people, generations, and communities. Years passed, and the streets of Berlin slowly transformed. Buildings rose from rubble, markets thrived again, and the city reclaimed its rhythm of life. Yet in the hearts of those who had been children during the airlift, certain memories remained vivid, memories of parachutes spiraling from gray skies, chocolate bars and gum landing gently in their hands, and a nameless pilot who had taken notice of them when the world seemed indifferent. These children, now adults, carried with them an understanding of generosity and resilience that had been forged in those fleeting moments of joy. They remembered the tactile thrill of reaching for a descending bundle, the anticipation coiling in their stomachs as each parachute twisted on the wind, and the communal laughter that followed successful catches. Parents recounted stories repeatedly, emphasizing how the candy drops had inspired collaboration, fairness, and sharing among their children. What seemed a simple act, chocolate in wrappers, gum in small bundles, had become an emotional and moral education in miniature, imparting lessons that formal classrooms could not replicate. Halvorsen's role in these experiences became legend. The candy bomber was no longer merely a man in uniform, he was a symbol, a narrative of kindness against the backdrop of destruction. His flights demonstrated the power of intentional action, creativity, and empathy to bridge gaps between people separated by circumstance, distance, and trauma. Letters and personal accounts continued to reach him, decades after the final drops. Adults wrote to express gratitude, to describe how the memory of the parachutes shaped their values, career choices, and approach to community. Some became educators, social workers, or civic leaders, citing the candy drops as pivotal experiences that nurtured empathy, collaboration, and imaginative problem-solving. Halvorsen often marveled at the ripple effect. What had begun as small, improvised acts in a single plane had expanded into a moral lesson passed through generations. The airlift, with its logistical magnitude, was remembered historically for its scale, strategy, and international significance, but for those who experienced the candy drops firsthand, it was remembered as a deeply personal, humanizing episode. Scholars and historians noted this dual legacy. In textbooks and documentaries, the Berlin Airlift was chronicled in numbers, tons of supplies delivered, and flights completed. Yet the story of the candy bomber offered a parallel narrative, one of micro-actions that fostered resilience, restored childhood wonder, and affirmed the power of individual initiative in shaping collective experience. In Berlin, the legend persisted. Communities spoke of Halvorsen with fondness, recounting the precise, joyful chaos of children chasing bundles, the ingenuity displayed in catching them, and the generosity that had flown down from the skies. The act itself became a touchstone for the city's post-war identity, a symbol of recovery not only in material terms but also in emotional and psychological restoration. Halvorsen, in his later years, reflected on the paradox of small acts making grand impacts. He understood that while the candy was ephemeral, the experiences it generated, anticipation, cooperation, joy, and hope, were enduring. These intangible effects outlasted wrappers, chocolate, and gum, embedding themselves in memory, shaping behavior, and nurturing the continuity of empathy across generations. In interviews and public talks, he emphasized this principle, that influence does not always require scale or grandeur. Sometimes, the most profound transformations arise from careful attention to small details, from acts of consideration, and from the courage to act creatively within one's sphere of possibility. The children who had grown up in those Berlin courtyards carried these lessons forward, sharing them with their own families and communities. They remembered the thrill of waiting, the ingenuity required to catch parachutes, and the delight of receiving attention and care from an unseen adult above. These experiences informed their values, teaching them the importance of noticing others, acting with compassion, and finding joy even in adversity. Halvorsen's own reflection was tinged with humility and quiet satisfaction. He recognized that he had been both participant and observer, agent and witness, in a process that transcended individual action. His flights had not only delivered candy, they had created a network of shared experience, shaped community resilience, and demonstrated the enduring power of human connection. In sum, the candy bomber's legacy was both tangible and intangible. The parachutes and sweets were fleeting, yet the memories, moral lessons, and emotional imprints were lasting. Berlin's children, once waiting in rubble-strewn courtyards, had grown into adults who remembered, who valued empathy, and who carried forward the subtle but profound lesson that small acts, done thoughtfully, can ripple outward in ways immeasurable yet deeply significant. And in the quiet reflection of Halvorsen's life, he understood that the true measure of these missions lay not in media recognition or military reports, but in the enduring hope, joy, and resilience that had taken root in the hearts of those children, a legacy carried forward by the very lives he had touched from the skies above a recovering city. As decades passed, the story of the candy bomber transcended the immediate geography of Berlin and entered the collective imagination of the world. Children who had grown up clutching chocolate bars and gum wrapped in tiny parachutes became adults who shared the tale with their families, educators, and colleagues. They spoke of hope delivered from the sky, of laughter echoing across rubble-strewn courtyards, and of a simple, yet profound, act of kindness that had left an indelible mark on their understanding of humanity. Halvorsen himself watched this evolution with quiet awe. What had begun as individual flights, meticulously planned yet humble in intention, had transformed into a multi-generational narrative. The act of dropping candy had become symbolic, teaching lessons far beyond the immediate thrill of chocolate or gum. It had become a story of resilience, empathy, and the tangible power of small, deliberate acts to alter lives and communities. Schools across the globe incorporated the story into lessons of history, morality, and civic responsibility. Educators highlighted the paradox of scale, a single pilot's initiative amidst a massive military and humanitarian operation could create ripples that influenced social behavior, moral development, and the collective memory of a city. Psychologists and social researchers later examined these acts as case studies in hope theory, community cohesion, and child development, noting how recognition and small gestures could create profound emotional and social impact. In Berlin, the legend lived on tangibly. Annual commemorations, plaques, and museum exhibits chronicled the airlift and Halvorsen's unique contribution. Children visiting these sites were taught to consider not only the historical logistics but the human stories: the child who ran to catch a parachute, the teacher who facilitated fairness, the parent who encouraged sharing. The narrative emphasized empathy, imagination, and attention to detail, illustrating how small actions could weave the fabric of community and culture. Halvorsen's personal reflections deepened as he observed the broader cultural influence. Letters from adults who had once been children in Berlin described careers shaped by the candy bombers' flights: educators, social workers, civic leaders, and advocates for humanitarian causes. Each letter was a testament to the long reach of intentional care, demonstrating that a single act, sustained thoughtfully, could propagate values, behaviors, and attitudes across decades. The legend also highlighted the intersection of practical skill and moral imagination. Halvorsen had relied on piloting expertise, attention to wind currents, and precise calculations, yet the profound impact lay in the combination of technical mastery with empathy. The parachutes were engineering feats, yes, but also moral instruments, designed to deliver not only sweets but joy, reassurance, and a tangible sense of care. Across generations. The story inspired reflection on the ways in which ordinary individuals can influence the world around them. It underscored that heroism need not be grandiose or celebrated; it can reside in deliberate attention to the needs of others, in creative solutions that address not just survival but the human spirit. For Halvorsen, the emotional resonance of his flights remained deeply personal. Each photograph, letter, and recounting of the candy drops was a reminder of the fragile, powerful connection between pilot and child, sky and street, intention and impact. He often reflected on the notion that history remembers large-scale operations and political maneuvers, yet the enduring legacy of small acts, acts rooted in empathy and imagination, can persist far longer in the hearts and minds of those touched. As new generations visited Berlin and learned of the airlift, educators emphasized the story's universal lessons: attentiveness to need, creativity in response, and the courage to act for the betterment of others. The narrative encouraged reflection on moral responsibility, community building, and the potential of individual action to inspire collective change. Children who once raced through rubble now encountered the story in classrooms, museums, and public discourse, allowing the emotional resonance to span decades. They learned that courage and creativity need not be monumental, that kindness, even when small and deliberate, can cascade outward in ways unimaginable at the moment of action. Halvorsen's enduring satisfaction stemmed not from recognition but from understanding the human thread that ran through every mission, every drop, and every child's laughter. The parachutes had served as catalysts for connection, shaping not only the immediate experiences of wartime Berlin but also the social and emotional development of generations. In this way, the candy bomber became more than a historical figure; he became a symbol of the profound consequences of deliberate, thoughtful action. His flights illustrated that within the vast machinery of history, individual creativity and empathy can carve pathways that alter the emotional landscape of communities and resonate across time. Today, the legend of Gail Halvorsen is celebrated not only for its ingenuity but for its enduring demonstration that hope, joy, and human connection can be delivered even amid destruction. The parachutes and sweets, once tangible, have dissolved into memory and story, yet the values they carried, resilience, compassion, creativity, and empathy, continue to flourish. And as those who received candy in Berlin pass their own lessons forward, the spirit of the candy bomber persists, proof that one person's thoughtful action can reverberate through history, inspiring, teaching, and connecting generations across time, geography, and circumstance. In his later years, Gail Halvorsen often returned in thought to Berlin, not as a city of rubble, ration lines, and scarcity, but as a place alive with memory, laughter, and resilience. The streets he had flown over decades earlier had been transformed physically, yet the emotional imprint of his flights remained palpable, carried in the hearts of those who had once chased tiny parachutes with wide-eyed anticipation. Halvorsen reflected on the paradox of these missions. What had begun as a minor improvisation, a pilot's whimsical attempt to bring sweetness to children, had evolved into a cultural and moral phenomenon. The flights had reminded him, and later the world, that the simplest gestures could resonate far beyond their immediate context. He recalled vivid details from countless missions: the careful packaging of candy, the gentle adjustment of parachutes, the precise calculation of wind currents, and the thrill of watching bundles spiral downward toward the waiting children. Each drop had been a moment of connection, a quiet dialogue between pilot and child, sky and street. He remembered the children's laughter echoing against fractured walls, their improvisation in catching the bundles, their mutual care in sharing the sweets, and the subtle but profound lessons of empathy and cooperation that unfolded naturally within the courtyards. These experiences had taught him more about human nature than years of structured training ever could. The candy bomber's legacy was reinforced not merely by the immediate delight of chocolate or gum, but by the intangible threads of connection and trust that wove through the city. Parents, educators, and neighbors played roles in sustaining this fragile ecosystem of hope, ensuring that each act of giving catalyzed cooperation, fairness, and shared joy. In later decades, Halvorsen was invited to Berlin to meet the children he had first inspired, now adults, professionals, educators, and parents themselves. These encounters were both humbling and poignant. They described how those moments of joy and attention had influenced their lives, guiding values, career paths, and approaches to community. The gratitude was tangible, yet Halvorsen felt no sense of pride in the conventional sense. Instead, he marveled at the human capacity to internalize hope, to translate kindness into action, and to perpetuate generosity across generations. Museums, schools, and commemorative events celebrated the airlift and the candy drops, ensuring that new generations would understand the human dimension of history, not merely the logistics or political context. Artifacts of the era, photos, letters, and actual candy bundles, served as tangible reminders, but the essence lay in storytelling, in recounting the anticipation, the ingenuity, and the joy that flourished even in adversity. Halvorsen often emphasized this when speaking publicly. He reminded audiences that the parachutes were not magical, that the candy was not extraordinary in itself. What mattered was intention, the careful thought, the empathy, the attention to the needs of others. He framed the candy bomber not as a hero in isolation, but as a participant in a larger human narrative, demonstrating that ordinary actions, performed thoughtfully, could ripple outward with extraordinary consequences. The emotional resonance of these acts persisted in unexpected ways. Adults who had once been children reported using lessons from the airlift in parenting, teaching, and community engagement. The act of noticing others, improvising creatively, and offering care had been modeled in miniature, then internalized and magnified across time. In this way, the candy bomber's influence extended far beyond Berlin, crossing oceans and generations, illustrating the enduring power of empathy in shaping human experience. Halvorsen's reflections were also deeply personal. He recognized the duality of history, the vast, impersonal forces of politics and logistics, and the intimate, human-scale interventions that could transform lives in ways statistics could never capture. His flights had been brief, the candy ephemeral, yet the human connections endured, demonstrating that even small acts of creativity and kindness could leave lasting legacies. The connections he forged with Berlin were maintained through correspondence, visits, and ongoing dialogue with those whose lives he had touched. These bonds affirmed the principle that acts of care, no matter how small or seemingly inconsequential, could anchor themselves in memory and influence behavior and culture across decades. In contemplating the long arc of his impact, Halvorsen understood that the true measure of his work was not in recognition or medals but in the continuity of human empathy and hope he had helped sustain. The laughter of children chasing parachutes, the shared joy in courtyards, and the community that arose around these small acts had become enduring symbols of resilience, creativity, and moral imagination. Today, the candy bomber stands as a figure not merely in history books but in human consciousness, a reminder that joy can be delivered in fragments, that hope can descend gently from above, and that individual initiative rooted in empathy can ripple outward in ways both measurable and ineffable. Halvorsen's flights, modest in scale yet monumental in emotional impact, demonstrated that one person's thoughtful action could resonate far beyond their immediate sphere, influencing behavior, values, and collective memory. And in the quiet reflection of his later years, he understood that the parachutes and candy were only the beginning. The true legacy was the persistence of human connection, the continuation of hope, and the proof that even amidst destruction, laughter, kindness, and creativity could thrive, leaving an indelible mark on hearts and history alike. As time progressed, the story of the candy bomber became inseparable from the broader narrative of the Berlin Airlift. Historians chronicled the monumental logistics of coal, flour, and fuel being delivered to a city under siege, but within that immense operation, the small acts of Halvorsen stood out as uniquely human, microcosms of compassion threading through an otherwise mechanical enterprise. Each flight was meticulously planned for precision, yet the real magic lay not in calculations or engineering, but in the human connection created between sky and street. Children looked upward, eyes wide, hearts brimming with anticipation, while adults observed the subtle choreography of hope and ingenuity unfolding before them. The city, scarred yet resilient, learned to synchronize with these parachutes, weaving social lessons into play and collaboration. Over the decades, the moral and emotional significance of these missions crystallized. The candy bomber exemplified how ordinary people could effect extraordinary change through empathy and thoughtful action. His flights taught that gestures, however small, carried the potential to restore trust, joy, and the fragile human spirit amid devastation. Schools, civic organizations, and international programs began citing his story as a case study in ethical leadership, social responsibility, and the psychology of hope. Students learned that heroism was not confined to military rank, political authority, or grandiose endeavors. Instead, it could be found in meticulous care, in seeing and responding to the needs of the vulnerable, in bridging gaps with creativity and attention. Halvorsen himself remained humble throughout this recognition. Interviews, awards, and public honors acknowledged his contributions, yet he emphasized the collective effort, the children, families, and fellow pilots who had participated in sustaining fairness, enthusiasm, and cooperation during the drops. In speeches, he consistently reframed the narrative from individual heroism to communal experience, highlighting the subtle, reciprocal nature of kindness. Berlin's citizens, once children racing through rubble to catch chocolate bars, carried the memory forward as adults. They recalled not only the candy but the lessons it imparted: patience in waiting, cooperation in sharing, attentiveness to fairness, and the joy that arises from thoughtful, unexpected care. In many cases, these individuals cited the airlift as a formative experience, shaping careers, values, and approaches to community engagement. The candy bomber, as legend and symbol, had transcended the confines of a single historical moment, becoming an archetype of moral action within the larger story of post-war recovery. Exhibitions, documentaries, and books captured the juxtaposition of destruction and delight, demonstrating how moments of connection could punctuate and transform even the bleakest landscapes. The parachutes, though physically transient, became enduring icons, representing resilience, hope, and the potency of intentional care. Halvorsen's reflections revealed the depth of insight gained from these missions. He noted that the airlift, immense in scale and logistical complexity, might have achieved physical sustenance for a city, but it was the small, deliberate acts, the chocolate bars, the gum, the parachutes, that nourished hearts and imaginations. These moments reminded him that historical significance often resides not solely in grand strategy, but in the intricate interplay between individual initiative and collective experience. Across generations, the candy bomber's story became a beacon for ethical consideration, creativity, and social empathy. It reminded educators, leaders, and ordinary citizens that their actions, however small, could influence behavior, shape memory, and inspire future generations. The Berlin children who had once awaited parachutes now shared their experiences with their own children and communities, embedding Halvorsen's lessons into the cultural consciousness. Halvorsen's final reflections were marked by humility and quiet pride. The joy of flight, the anticipation in the streets below, and the enduring ripple effects of his actions illustrated a fundamental truth: human connection, when nurtured thoughtfully, could transcend time, space, and circumstance. He often mused that the candy bomber legacy would endure not because of medals or recognition, but because of the joy, hope, and moral lessons carried forward by those touched by his flights. In every courtyard where parachutes had descended, in every classroom where the story was recounted, and in every adult who carried forward the principles of empathy and attentiveness, the candy bomber lived on. His flights had demonstrated the power of small gestures to change lives, rebuild trust, and inspire a culture of care. Ultimately, the story of Gail Halvorsen and the Berlin Airlift serves as a timeless lesson: in a world often dominated by grand forces, complexity, and hardship, the deliberate actions of a single individual, rooted in empathy, creativity, and courage, can ripple outward, shaping history not only in logistics and strategy but in the hearts, minds, and values of generations to come. The candy, the parachutes, the flights, they were ephemeral. But the hope, the joy, the lessons of kindness and resilience, those endured. And in this enduring legacy, the world witnesses the profound truth that human ingenuity, tempered by compassion, can bridge destruction and despair, leaving an imprint far more lasting than any material reward. The story of Gail Halvorsen, the candy bomber, eventually transcended Berlin, reaching audiences across continents. Educators, historians, and civic leaders began to cite his actions as exemplars of ethical initiative in the face of adversity. Children in faraway countries learned of the parachutes drifting down from the skies, of chocolate bars and gum landing gently into eager hands, and of the quiet, imaginative heroism of a single man who noticed the smallest, yet most profound, human need. The airlift itself, monumental in scale, became inseparable from the candy bomber narrative in popular memory. While historians analyzed supply tonnage, flight frequency, and international diplomacy, Halvorsen's story highlighted the human dimension: how empathy, creativity, and attention to detail could ripple outward, reshaping communities, values, and the psyche of a generation. In classrooms, teachers posed questions that invited reflection: could a small act of kindness change the world? How can individuals make a difference amidst massive systems? What does it mean to recognize the needs of others even when circumstances are dire? Students explored these inquiries, inspired by the example of Halvorsen's parachutes, and began to see their own potential for action, creativity, and moral courage. Museums and exhibitions worldwide showcased artifacts, photographs, and letters that chronicled the candy drops. Visitors saw not only chocolate wrappers and parachutes but also the faces of children racing across rubble-strewn courtyards, frozen in moments of joy. The visual juxtaposition of devastation and delight offered an emotional narrative that statistics alone could not convey. Halvorsen's flights were analyzed not merely for technical ingenuity but for their psychological and social impact. Psychologists studied the responses of Berlin's children to understand resilience, hope, and the formation of social bonds under stress. Communities observed how small, deliberate interventions could catalyze collaboration, empathy, and shared joy. The ripple effect of these flights extended into humanitarian strategy, demonstrating that successful relief efforts often require attention not only to material sustenance but also to psychological and emotional well-being. Halvorsen himself was invited to share his experiences at conferences, schools, and civic events worldwide. In these talks, he consistently emphasized principles over personal accolades, noticing the needs of others, acting creatively within one's means, and valuing human connection above procedural formality. His humility resonated, reinforcing the idea that heroism is often quiet, deliberate, and relational, rather than performative or hierarchical. Decades later, commemorations in Berlin included ceremonies in which former children, now adults, recounted the ways in which the candy drops had influenced their lives. Some had become educators, social workers, civic leaders, and humanitarian advocates, attributing their vocation and values to those formative moments. The parachutes, though long gone, had delivered lessons that endured, creating cross-generational continuity in ethical and emotional awareness. The universal appeal of Halvorsen's story rested in its simplicity and humanity. It revealed that even amid global conflict, individual initiative grounded in care and creativity could reach across boundaries, transform perceptions, and instill hope. In a world often preoccupied with metrics, strategy, and power, the Candy Bomber reminded humanity that small, intentional acts of kindness could reverberate far beyond their immediate context. Halvorsen's legacy extended into literature, media, and public discourse. Documentaries, books, and educational programs captured the essence of his actions, ensuring that new generations would encounter the story not only as history but as moral guidance. Children learned to imagine themselves as agents of positive change, equipped with creativity, empathy, and courage to act in ways both practical and profoundly humane. The story also inspired humanitarian organizations to consider innovative approaches in relief operations. The principle was clear: addressing the human spirit is as vital as providing material resources. Halvorsen's candy drops became emblematic of interventions that recognize emotional and psychological dimensions, shaping policy, education, and community engagement strategies for decades. The cultural memory of the Candy Bomber also served as a counterpoint to narratives dominated by conflict and destruction. It offered a testament to human resilience, illustrating that even amid war, despair, and scarcity, moments of connection, delight, and care could flourish. Each parachute, each chocolate bar, and each gleeful child created a network of relational threads that endured long after the airlift's practical objectives were met. Reflecting on this global resonance, Halvorsen understood that the airlift's logistical triumph was inseparable from its human dimension. His flights had not only delivered sustenance, they had delivered hope, attention, and a model of ethical initiative. And as the story of the Candy Bomber continued to be retold across generations and continents, it carried with it a timeless moral, that small, thoughtful, and creative acts of kindness can ripple outward, touching lives, shaping communities, and inspiring a culture of empathy that persists far beyond the immediacy of action. In essence, the Candy Bomber became a universal symbol, teaching that humanity can flourish through deliberate compassion, that hope can descend from the skies even in the darkest of times, and that one individual's attention to the needs of others can leave a legacy enduring far longer than any material gift or historic record. In the twilight of his life, Gail Halvorsen reflected upon the paradox of his existence: a single individual, armed with little more than a plane, a few bundles of candy, and an unwavering sense of empathy, had managed to leave a mark on thousands of lives. Each parachute, delicately descending over the scarred streets of Berlin, had carried not merely chocolate or gum, but the essence of hope and human connection. Halvorsen understood that his story was inseparable from the children who had chased those bundles, from the communities that had nurtured fairness and cooperation, and from the co-pilots and fellow airmen who had supported him quietly, without expectation of recognition. The Candy Bomber was not merely a pilot executing a mission, he was an intermediary of joy, a messenger of reassurance in a city grappling with the aftermath of devastation. His reflections often dwelled on the enduring lesson of attention, the simple act of noticing a need and responding thoughtfully. He realized that these small, deliberate gestures could ripple outward, transforming communities, shaping values, and instilling hope in ways that statistics, medals, or historical accounts could never fully capture. Even decades later, the faces of Berlin's children remained vivid in his memory, wide-eyed, expectant, brimming with the raw joy of possibility. He recalled the ingenuity displayed in catching parachutes, the care with which bundles were shared among friends, and the subtle social lessons that emerged from these acts of communal delight. These moments crystallized a universal truth: the human spirit thrives not only through survival but through recognition, connection, and shared experience. Halvorsen often reflected on the fragile interplay between technical skill and moral imagination. The candy drops required precise piloting, calculation of wind currents, and careful preparation, yet the true power lay in the human connection they enabled. Without empathy, the bundles would have been mere objects; with it, they became instruments of resilience and joy. In sharing this insight with audiences worldwide, Halvorsen emphasized that heroism is rarely loud or performative. It manifests in deliberate attention, creative problem-solving, and acts of care that may seem minor but reverberate across time and space. The airlift, monumental in its logistics, became interwoven with these personal, moral dimensions. Berlin's recovery was not measured solely in tons of supplies delivered but in laughter restored, trust rebuilt, and hope rekindled among the city's youngest residents. The children, who would carry these experiences into adulthood, became living testaments to the enduring impact of thoughtful intervention. Halvorsen also considered the collective legacy of the Candy Bomber story. Beyond individual memories, it had evolved into a moral touchstone, a cultural narrative illustrating that small actions, grounded in empathy and creativity, could inspire communities, guide behavior, and educate generations. The narrative of chocolate parachutes descending over a war-torn city encapsulated the profound capacity of humans to restore, uplift, and connect even amidst adversity. Museums, commemorations, and educational programs ensured that the story would continue to resonate. Children today, thousands of miles away and decades later, learn not only of the airlift but of the ethical principle embedded in Halvorsen's flights, that recognition, care, and intentional action matter. The Candy Bomber became more than a historical figure; he became a lens through which humanity could examine the power of individual initiative, the moral weight of empathy, and the beauty of hope delivered thoughtfully. In his quieter moments, Halvorsen pondered the paradox of impermanence and permanence. The chocolate was consumed, the parachutes eventually deteriorated, and the flights themselves became events in the distant past. Yet the emotional and moral legacy persisted. It existed in memory, in storytelling, in education, and in the ripples of influence that had shaped careers, values, and social cohesion. The tangible may fade, but the intangible, the lessons, the hope, the human connection, remains. Halvorsen often reflected on how ordinary circumstances can yield extraordinary opportunities for impact. The airlift was a vast, complex operation, yet within it, a single individual could shape culture, morality, and emotional life through mindful action. The story of the Candy Bomber offers a timeless template for human engagement: notice need, act creatively and thoughtfully, and trust that the effects may travel farther than immediate perception allows. In the final analysis, Halvorsen recognized that his flights had been a collaboration between skill and empathy, logistics and imagination, obligation and moral vision. The Candy Bomber's legacy was therefore dual: historical, in the context of post-war recovery, and deeply human, in its influence on generations of children, families, and communities. And in this duality lies the ultimate lesson of his life's work, that even in the shadow of destruction, individual initiative, guided by compassion, can produce enduring light. The story concludes not with the consumption of chocolate or the descent of parachutes but with the continuation of hope, the perpetuation of moral imagination, and the realization that one person's deliberate, thoughtful action can resonate far beyond what the eye can see, shaping the hearts, minds, and lives of generations yet to come. Gail Halvorsen's reflection, in essence, becomes universal: the world is vast and often harsh, yet within it, small acts of care, creativity, and attention to others hold the power to transform, inspire, and endure. As the final decades of the 20th century unfolded, the story of Gail Halvorsen, the Candy Bomber, took on a life of its own, emerging from personal memory into global legend. The Berlin Airlift remained a monumental logistical achievement, yet it was the small, deliberate acts of empathy, creativity, and attentiveness that captured imaginations and hearts alike. Each parachute that drifted from sky to street had created an invisible thread connecting pilot and child, hope and despair, imagination and reality. The cinematic quality of these moments became apparent to historians and storytellers: children racing through rubble, eyes wide, hands reaching skyward, their laughter ricocheting off fractured buildings, all underscored by the quiet heroism of a man acting with ingenuity and compassion. In museums and educational programs, the Candy Bomber was celebrated not merely as a historical figure but as a symbol of human potential. Visitors gazed at photographs of children clutching chocolate, letters penned by grateful parents, and bundles carefully prepared by Halvorsen himself. The story inspired reflection and dialogue. What does it mean to act thoughtfully in a world beset by complexity and conflict? How can ordinary individuals influence communities, shape values, and instill hope through small but deliberate actions? Across continents, the narrative resonated with children and adults alike. Teachers recounted Halvorsen's flights in classrooms, challenging students to envision how creativity, courage, and empathy could be wielded in their own lives. Civic organizations invoked the story as a model for ethical leadership, community engagement, and humanitarian innovation. Psychologists studied the impact on Berlin's children, noting how anticipation, collaboration, and recognition during the candy drops influenced social cohesion and emotional resilience for decades to come. Halvorsen himself, now advanced in years, continued to emphasize the moral dimension of his flights. In interviews, speeches, and personal correspondence, he underscored the principle that heroism need not be grandiose or performative, it can reside in attentiveness, creativity, and acts of care, no matter how small. Each candy drop, carefully timed and delivered, had been a lesson in patience, coordination, and moral imagination, a lesson that persisted far beyond the immediate delight of chocolate or gum. Berlin, long rebuilt, still honored the memory of the airlift and Halvorsen's contributions. Annual commemorations and public ceremonies featured speeches by former children, now adults, recounting with clarity the profound influence of those flights. They spoke of values learned through play, fairness, sharing, collaboration, and joy. The story's enduring relevance lay not in nostalgia alone, but in the active transmission of ethical principles, demonstrating that empathy, creativity, and intentionality can ripple outward, shaping communities and future generations. Scholars, educators, and storytellers recognized that the Candy Bomber's legacy offered a model of hope within history's often bleak panorama. In the midst of political conflict, scarcity, and reconstruction, one individual's initiative had catalyzed laughter, human connection, and moral learning. These acts, though physically small, proved that attention, imagination, and compassion could achieve impact far exceeding their apparent scale. The cinematic narrative is also imbued with sensory memory, the wind swirling between buildings, the soft flutter of parachutes, the gleam of chocolate wrappers, the exclamations of delight, and the sight of small hands stretching skyward. Every detail evokes the emotional resonance of a city simultaneously broken and alive, a people simultaneously recovering and celebrating, and a pilot whose ingenuity and empathy bridged worlds. As Halvorsen reflected upon the enduring story, he noted that its power derived from universality. Every generation, in every culture, could recognize the principles embedded in his flights, noticing need, responding creatively, acting thoughtfully, and cultivating joy and hope. The Candy Bomber's narrative transcended Berlin and World War II, offering timeless insight into human connection and moral action. In conclusion, the legacy of Gail Halvorsen is not contained solely in history books, photographs, or museum artifacts. It lives in the laughter of children who, across generations and continents, learn to notice others, act with kindness, and imagine creative ways to lift the human spirit. It lives in classrooms, civic programs, and family stories, demonstrating that even amidst hardship and scarcity, the human capacity for empathy, ingenuity, and hope can prevail. The Candy Bomber stands as a testament to the enduring power of small, deliberate acts. He reminds us that heroism can be quiet yet profound, that generosity can be simple yet transformative, and that each thoughtful action holds the potential to ripple across time and space, shaping lives, communities, and moral consciousness. And as the final flights faded into memory, as the chocolate and gum were long consumed, the parachutes of hope continued to descend in the hearts and minds of those who understood the lesson, that even a single person, acting with care and imagination, can illuminate the world, leaving a legacy that endures far beyond the bounds of history or circumstance. As the sun set over Berlin, casting long shadows across streets once scarred by conflict, the story of Gail Halvorsen, the candy bomber, settled into the collective memory, both of the city and the world. The airlift, monumental in its logistical achievement, had delivered fuel, coal, and food, sustaining survival. Yet Halvorsen's flights, small in comparison to tons of supplies, delivered something equally vital: hope, joy, and a tangible sense of care. In quiet reflection, he considered the paradox. The candy was ephemeral, consumed within moments, yet the emotional resonance, the moral and psychological imprint, endured far longer than the fleeting sweetness. Each parachute that drifted from the sky carried more than chocolate or gum. It carried a message. Someone was watching, someone cared, and even amidst destruction, small gestures could transform despair into delight. Former children of Berlin, now adults, recounted with clarity the moments that had shaped their lives. They remembered the thrill of racing through rubble, the camaraderie formed in sharing treasures, and the subtle lessons of fairness and cooperation embedded within play. Many credited these experiences with shaping their values, careers, and outlooks on community, empathy, and moral responsibility. Halvorsen's flights had inadvertently crafted a moral experiment, demonstrating that attentiveness, creativity, and compassion could ripple outward, influencing behavior, society, and memory across decades. Across the globe, the story inspired generations. Educators used it to teach ethics, problem-solving, and the importance of noticing need. Psychologists and social scientists analyzed it as an example of emotional resilience and social cohesion. Civic leaders cited it as a model for human-centered innovation in times of crisis. The candy bomber's narrative transcended geography and time, illustrating that individual initiative, when grounded in empathy, could resonate universally. Halvorsen often emphasized that heroism is quiet, relational, and rooted in intention. It does not require grandeur or public recognition. It requires observation, thoughtfulness, and a willingness to act creatively in the service of others. His flights had exemplified this principle in practice. A simple act of dropping candy transformed into a lifelong lesson of empathy, hope, and moral courage. The visual and emotional imagery remained powerful. The wind whistling between skeletal buildings, the slow rotation of parachutes, children reaching skyward, and the ephemeral gleam of chocolate wrappers amidst the gray ruins. This cinematic memory persisted in photographs, letters, oral histories, and in the hearts of those who experienced it firsthand. Museums, educational programs, and commemorative events ensured that the story would continue to inspire. Each retelling reinforced its universal lessons, that small gestures matter, that creativity and care can transform human experience, and that hope can flourish even in the bleakest conditions. In Halvorsen's personal reflection, the legacy of the candy bomber was both historical and deeply human. It demonstrated that individual initiative, guided by empathy and imagination, could shape culture, values, and memory. The parachutes and sweets were fleeting, the lessons and emotional impact were enduring. Even decades later, adults who had once been children in Berlin carried these lessons forward, sharing them with their own families, communities, and students. The airlift, monumental as it was, had achieved physical sustenance. Halvorsen's candy drops had achieved something equally vital: the nourishment of hope, imagination, and human connection. The juxtaposition of destruction and delight illustrated the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring potential of deliberate acts of care. In the end, the candy bomber's story became a symbol, a living narrative of moral imagination, empathy, and creative intervention. It teaches that even one individual, acting with care, thoughtfulness, and ingenuity, can shape the world in ways that endure across generations. The chocolate may be gone, the parachutes vanished, but the lessons, the hope, and the joy continue to descend, carried not on wings but in memory, imagination, and human hearts. Gail Halvorsen's flights remind us that the skies themselves can become instruments of kindness, that small actions can bridge despair and delight, and that heroism resides not only in grand achievement but in noticing, caring, and acting creatively. And so, the eternal flight of hope continues, a parachute drifting down over a playground, a child's laughter echoing over rebuilt streets, a story told anew in classrooms around the world. The Candy Bomber's legacy endures, proof that even in moments of darkness, human imagination, empathy, and intentionality can illuminate the world, leaving a mark that time cannot erase. In this final reflection, one truth becomes clear: the measure of a life is not merely in what is achieved materially, but in the lives touched, the hope inspired, and the enduring moral resonance of thoughtful, compassionate action. Gail Halvorsen's parachutes, chocolate, and gum became instruments of this timeless lesson, reminding humanity that even the smallest gestures, when guided by empathy and creativity, can ripple outward, illuminating generations, shaping communities, and fostering enduring connection across the tapestry of human experience.